Got Greg joining. Hey, Greg, good to have you as a regular listener.
So this is a question not really pertaining to me, but it kind of pertains to like reality distortion field. I'm kind of curious about it. I watched the WeWork documentary on Adam Neuman.
Yes.
And he kind of had this, and Steve Jobs and like Bill Clinton, like people who are amazing storytellers and visionaries tend to have it.
Right.
Kind of curious to hear like, your insights on that and how that relates to, being a great storyteller or being really good at, sharing your vision and getting people excited around you, like charisma and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question was around this concept of a reality distortion field. So for people who are not familiar with that term, it's commonly applied to folks that, like you mentioned, Bill Clinton, Steve Jobs, maybe even Elon Musk and Adam Neumann, who kind of when you're in their presence, time almost feels like it stands still. You feel very engaged with the person, and they're incredibly sort of influential and engaging. Partly, I think there's a couple components to that phenomenon. Partly, I think it's a power thing, right? Like when you meet Bill Clinton and he's the president of the United States, or now ex-president of the United States, there is just like this natural awe because it's not every day that you get to meet a president. And so I think as a result of that, there's almost like a natural trance that people fall into when they meet people of power or status, and they almost become more receptive to their influence. I bet it was different, quite frankly, when Bill Clinton was a student and quite frankly a nobody before he was president. Like the suit and the position does kind of make the man. In fact, there's really good research on this. These were the Milgram experiments that were done at Yale University. You might have heard the electroshock experiments where they bring subjects into an experimental lab and they tell them to shock another participant in increasing dosages of electricity and see at what point would they stop. So the interesting thing is they did a comparison where they had it on campus at Yale with a researcher that was wearing a white coat versus off campus and not wearing the white coat. And as you can imagine, the people who are like a doctor at Yale telling you that this study is okay and you should go electrocute this person, people are more likely to comply versus if you're kind of a nobody. So we know that power and status does influence and persuade people. So I think that's actually one big part of it. The other big part of it is I think you mentioned this in passing, is charisma, right? To me, that's actually the biggest component of it. All those people, to some varying degree, were or are charismatic. And charisma, I actually find to be the key sort of element is really good active listening skills. Like if you talk to people who've met Bill Clinton, they might meet him in a crowd of people. He's busy, shaking hands and kissing babies. But when they're in his presence, they feel like they're the only person in the room with them. And that's actually a skill you don't have to be president to practice. It's just being really, really engaged, having your full attention with that person, like really like paying attention to their facial expressions, their emotions. You're really in the moment, and you're kind of mirror neurons, you're vibing with them, so to speak. And that's actually like a very good proxy for what we do in the context of psychotherapy, right? So when I'm having, live sessions, which are either in person or in video nowadays, I'm really, really trying to be connected with the person, obviously shutting out all other distraction so that you feel very present and that person feels heard, understood, and respected. In fact, the biggest sort of therapeutic faux pas that you can do is like have your therapist fall asleep on you, right? That's like almost like traumatizing. It might end the relationship. So active listening is a key component of charisma. The other part of it is really like warmth is the way that I would describe it, right? You can be a really good listener, but you're kind of cold. And I think that is more than just like the nodding and the mm-hms that are part of active listening. It's making the person sort of feel, the way that Carl Rogers would put it is unconditional positive regard, right? So this comes from humanistic psychology in the sense of when you're talking with someone, do you feel like they're judging you? Or do you feel like I can basically say anything and I will not feel a sense of shame that emanates from this other person, right? I think that's really like the warmth and compassion, the sympathy. Like if you're telling a story about how something hurt you, they feel sympathetic, right? They feel what you feel. If you're telling a story that you can empathize, you understand what they feel. So all of those components really add, I think, to the charismatic charm that make people, sucked into that reality distortion field. The final part of it is a little bit more personality driven. Actually, all three of those figures that you mentioned actually have very different personalities, right? And not to overly diagnose, but like Steve Jobs is generally not considered actually like super charismatic per se. He's highly influential. I think people were more intimidated, quite frankly, by Steve Jobs. And I think he certainly was somewhere on the narcissistic spectrum. But narcissists actually can have that reality distortion field as well, because they're incredibly confident, right? Narcissists, or at least they are superficially confident in the way that they sort of express or come off. And sometimes just that amount of confidence can create that reality distortion field. So there's great stories of Steve Jobs where he'd kind of walk into a room, listen to a project plan about when the next iPhone's going to be launched, and it's supposed to take 3 months, and he'd demand, why can't it be done in 1? And people would just kind of, coalesce to that reality distortion field and do whatever it takes to get done, even though it would seem impossible, right? So, it's almost like a belief is self-fulfilling prophecy. If someone who's highly competent and confident comes in and they're your boss and you're like, look, we can do this in a month, and you're like, okay, I guess we'll figure out how many nights and weekends do I need to work to make this happen? What resources do I need? Who else can I bring in? And then you kind of make the impossible possible. I don't think you need to be narcissistic, but I do think confidence is the underlying characteristic that drives that. Adam Neuman is in a different category. Not to diagnose him, but there's certainly some potential bipolar traits that he expressed, because if you read the news articles about him, they talk about only sleeping 4 hours a night, having meetings at 2, 3 in the morning. And people who are on the bipolar spectrum tend to have hypomanic, or what's called manic qualities, right? This is like people who have a very decreased need for sleep, high libido, engage in new projects, and it's this high amount of energy that they express, and that can come off sometimes as charismatic. It's often very effective in sales, right? So when you're pitching, like when people will talk about Adam Neuman pitching SoftBank or other investors, he presented a very grandiose vision. And people with bipolar can have delusions of grandeur, but if you are talented and you have the money and you have the team, some of those things that may seem delusional to the ordinary person may sound actually like the next great CEO to a venture capitalist. And so to his credit, obviously he was very great at garnering resources, right? In terms of getting investment money and convincing people to join him in this mission. Now, the problem was the execution was obviously tragically flawed, and obviously WeWork imploded for a number of reasons. And that's the problem with bipolar and kind of mania, is it's very easy to start the project. It's very hard to complete them unless you have a team around you that can help support you and make sure that it is. And you're obviously not biting off more than you can chew, which clearly Adam and WeWork unfortunately did. So obviously we don't condone or support sort of like mania or kind of manic behavior in order to create a reality distortion field. But I think the underlying trait, just as the underlying trait in narcissism is confidence, I would say the underlying trait in mania is a high degree of positivity, right? Like if you really deep down believe like this is the next big success, people will believe that as well, right? Versus if you're kind of lying through your teeth, you're not really confident about yourself or the underlying business, and you're trying to pitch it in a way, I think people can read between the lines. They can read your body language. There's a disconnect, there's some dissonance between what you're saying and how you're saying it. But when you're kind of in it, whether it's a manic state or you are genuinely positive, I do think that positivity and that comes across, and you're like, you know what, this is kind of a crazy idea, but I think this guy can do it. I think this guy can pull it off, and his positivity is infectious, right? So I think that's the underlying trait that you can probably learn from kind of an Adam Neumann or kind of a Kanye West, who is publicly actually bipolar and has talked about that, is also very similar, right? When you hear his interviews, he's comparing himself to Pablo Picasso, Walt Disney, all these guys, which sounds ludicrous at the time, but he's literally, I believe, the wealthiest African American on the planet right now. I think he's a multi-billionaire. And so is he at the same status as those guys? I don't know, but he's certainly done a lot, both for the music industry and the fashion industry. I would consider him probably close to the top of both of those fields. So, of course you have to back up, what you say, but I think those people have been very, influential about it. The take-home lesson here is you don't need to be on a pathological spectrum, whether it's narcissism, bipolar, or any other sort of pathology, in order to be influential and create sort of reality distortion fields. I think you can just take the underlying facets, which is a high degree of self-confidence, a high degree of positivity and genuine belief in your mission, very good active listening skills, and emanating sort of a warmth and compassion that makes people feel connected. If you can do those 4 things, I think you can replicate that to some degree. And the final thing I would say is, look, practice makes perfect, right? These guys, over the course of their lives, probably practice a lot of these skills, whether consciously or unconsciously. But social skills is something you can absolutely practice. And so I would encourage you to do these things in safe context and get feedback from people, whether it's an interview or you're practicing with your friends or you're just going to a party and you're trying to practice your charisma. It can, just by like slowing down, changing your tone, emanating warmth, all these kind of things that we talked about, you'll get better and better at it by kind of analyzing yourself or getting feedback from other people.